This weekly word is based on a part of the book Unbroken and also Philippians 4:7, as you will learn. Philippians 4:7 says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God." The sermon in church on Sunday, 24 July, was on that part of the Lord's Prayer about, "Give us this day our daily bread." That reminded me of the weekly word last week on the story of Louis Zamperini. Louis and the two survivors of a plane crash were in a raft and could have said the Lord's Prayer, and the verse I just quoted by saying, "Give us this day our daily water." To recall for you some of the story of those three survivors of the B-24 plane crash in late May 1953 in the Pacific Ocean. They were adrift for 47 days with little food or water. On that particular day, their water was empty and they were desperately thirsty and overheated as they were near the equator. What to do? They needed rain, but the sky was clear. On the third day without water, a smudge of a cloud appeared, darkened over the raft, and the sun was darkened, and then down came the rain. On day 21, the water again ran out, and rain was needed. On that day, without water, Louis prayed, "If you will save me, I will serve you forever." That single sentence prayer is later important in the post-POW life of Louis as a prisoner of war. On the raft, it seemed like a prayer to bargain with God. However, God would understand the spirit and circumstances under which Louis offered that prayer. In the reading of Luke 11, 1 through 13, the pastor highlighted verse 9, "Everyone who asks receives, and everyone who searches finds, and everyone who knocks, the door will be open." Yes, ask, search, and knock. I say that is what Louis did in his prayer without his knowledge. In doing so, he had to hope and trust God would answer his prayer. Louis also learned that he had to be patient for his prayer to be answered. God answered the prayer of Louis for water the very next day. Mac, one of the three, later died as he lost his desire to live. Louis and Phil were captured by the Japanese on day 47, July 13, 1943. They were prisoners of war from then until released on 5 September 1945. During this time period, the POWs were on very small food rations, a starvation diet, in fact, and beaten daily. This was especially true for Louis, as one Japanese guard, Watanabe, was very, very difficult with him in beating him. He was nicknamed the Bird. The Bird took delight in beating him almost daily. He especially liked to remove his large belt, swing it around his body, and hit Louis on the head with the heavy buckle again and again. After the war ended, Louis thought about returning to Japan, finding the Bird and killing him. Louis would go to bed and have nightmares of the Bird beating him, severely. To deaden the pain of nightmares, Louis took up drinking daily and became an alcoholic. His wife, Cynthia, had patience that seemingly would not end. Then Billy Graham held a crusade in Los Angeles in September, October 1949. It was also the moment Cynthia decided to divorce Louis. Cynthia went alone to hear Billy Graham and came home a different person. She told Louis she was not going to divorce him, but stay with him. Then she badgered Louis into going to the Graham crusade. He sat down sullen in his seat and couldn't wait for the sermon to end so he could go home. Go home to drinking in order to get to sleep and cope with another nightmare. The second night they went to the crusade, Graham preached on John 8 and the woman caught in adultery. When Graham finished, Louis was indignant and said to himself, "I am a good man. I am a good man." However, it seemed he knew it was a lie because he knew what kind of man he had turned out to be. I now pick up from the book Unbroken. The third night, Cynthia badgered Louis to go to the crusade again. This was after the nightmare of almost choking his wife to death. Here's what happened. Louis knocked a bird to the ground in the nightmare, straddled him, and locked his hands on the neck of the bird. There was a scream. Was it the bird or was it him? He jolted awake and discovered it was Cynthia, and he found himself on her body in the process of strangling her. She decided a divorce was in order, but as you know, she became a changed person. She became a Christian. She decided to stay married to Louis and pray for his healing. On another night at the crusade, after listening to Graham's sermon, Louis was angry. But there was this nameless uneasiness in his mind. The sharks were rasping their back on the bottom of the raft he was in. There was a thought he must not think again about, a memory he must not see. With the urgency of a bolting animal, he wanted to run. Graham then said, "Here tonight there is a drowning man, a drowning woman, a drowning girl that is lost in the sea of life." Louis grew more and more angry. Then there was an altar call. Louis grabbed Cynthia's arm, stood up, and bolted to leave the tent. That night, after a time of drinking, he lay in bed, being belt whipped again by the bird, but the face was that of the devil. He woke up Sunday morning and Cynthia wanted to return to the crusade. They argued for hours and Louis finally gave in. Graham spoke that night on the world in an age of war, an age of persecution and suffering. Then he said, "If you look into the heavens, you can see the stars and the footprints of God." Louis was winding tight. He then remembered that day of the three of them in the raft, and they were dying of thirst. Graham then said, "God works miracles, miracles one after another. If you suffer," Jesus said, "I'll give you the grace to go forward." Louis was bathed in sweat. He felt accused and pressed by a frantic urge to flee. Graham then had an altar call and said no one was to leave. Lewis pushed past people in a row charging for the exit. As he reached the aisle, he stopped. His mind was tumbling. He felt enraged, violent, on the edge of explosion. Then the memories came back. He was a body on the raft, dying of thirst, and he felt the words whisper from his swollen lips. It was a promise thrown at heaven, a promise he had not kept, a promise he had allowed himself to forget until just this instant. If you will save me, I will serve you forever. And there, standing under a circus tent, his feet in sawdust on a clear night, and that was the last flashback of the bird he would ever have. In his mind, Lewis felt rain falling, God's rain. Lewis went forward and became a changed man, a dedicated Christian. Lewis was silent on the drive home, and Cynthia kept wary eyes on him. When they arrived at the apartment, Lewis went straight to his large cache of liquor and dumped the alcohol down the drain. He then got his cartons of cigarettes and girly magazines and dumped them down the trash chute. In bed, he no longer had the nightmares of the bird and slept in peace, a peace that was beyond human understanding. Lewis learned per Philippians 4:7, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and in peace, God, which transcends the understanding of people, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Lewis learned that he had peace and happiness, and along with Cynthia, they had so the rest of their lives. They were married for 54 years, and he also returned to Japan to forgive his former Japanese guards, but he couldn't find the bird. Lewis went on to serve Jesus Christ until his death at age 97. God bless you, and have a good week. And next week you will hear the story of my friend, a Jew, Elliot Ossowitz.